The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, also called the Battle of Chalons or the Battle of Maurica, took place in AD 451 between a coalition led by the Roman general Flavius Aetius and the Visigothic king Theodoric I against the Huns and their allies commanded by their leader Attila. It was one of the last major military operations of the Western Roman Empire. Although Germanic federates composed the majority of the allied Roman army, the battle was strategically inconclusive. The Romans stopped the Huns' attempt to establish vassals in Roman Gaul, and installed Merovech as king of the Franks. However, the Huns successfully looted and pillaged much of Gaul and crippled the military capacity of the Romans and Visigoths. The Huns were later destroyed by a coalition of their Germanic vassals at the Battle of Nidau in 454. Prelude. By 450 AD, Roman control of Gaul had been restored in much of the province, although control over all of the provinces beyond Italy was continuing to diminish. Armorica was only nominally part of the empire, and Germanic tribes occupying Roman territory had been forcibly settled and bound by treaty as foederati under their own leaders. Northern Gaul between the Rhine north of Xanten and the Marne rivers had unofficially been abandoned to the Salian Franks. The line of nominal Roman control ran from Cologne to Amiens and to the coast at Boulogne. The Visigoths on the river Garonne were growing restive. The Burgundians in Sarpaudia were more submissive but likewise awaiting an opening for revolt. The parts of Gaul still securely in Roman control were the Mediterranean coastline, a region including Aurelianum, the Seine and the Loire, as far north as Amiens, the middle and upper Rhine, and downstream along the Rhone River. The historian Jordanes states that Attila was enticed by the Vandal king Gaiseric to wage war on the Visigoths. At the same time, Gaiseric would attempt to sow strife between the Visigoths and the Western Roman Empire. However, Jordan's account of Gothic history is notoriously biased and unreliable, and much of it is omitted or garbled. Connor Whately notes that Jordan's entire work may in fact be a political statement on the campaigns of Belisarius and the policies of Justinian, who also considers the Battle of Chalons to be the climax of the peace. Therefore, any claims by Jordanes must be taken with great scrutiny. Other contemporary writers offer different motivations. Honoria, the sister of the Emperor Valentinian III, had been betrothed to the former consul Herculanus the year before. In 450, she sent the eunuch Hyacinthus to the Hunnic king asking for Attila's help in escaping her confinement, with her ring as proof of the letter's legitimacy. Allegedly Attila interpreted it as offering her hand in marriage, and he claimed half of the empire as a dowry. He demanded Honoria to be delivered along with the dowry. Valentinian rejected these demands, and Attila used it as an excuse to launch a destructive campaign through Gaul. Hughes suggests otherwise, saying that the reality of this interpretation should be that Honoria was using Attila's status as honorary magister militum for political leverage. Another possible explanation is that in 449, the king of the Franks, Claudio, died. Aetius had adopted the younger son of the Franks to secure the Rhine frontier, and the elder son had fled to the court of Attila. Boner and more recently Kim take this theory a step further, reasoning that it was the real cause of the war, and the primary reason Attila attacked Gaul. Boner argues that Childeric was a vassal of Attila, and he identifies the founders of the Merovingian dynasty as the two claimants to the Frankish throne. In the somewhat garbled story of the Chronicle of Fredregar, Childeric was expelled by the Franks and allegedly forced to live in exile in Thuringia for 8 years, which was a Hunnic vassal at the time. Kim argues that the character of Wiomad represents the Huns who helped Childeric fight the Romans and engineered his return from exile, and concludes that the main objective of Attila at Chalons was conquest of the Franks and establishment of vassal states on the Rhine. Attila crossed the Rhine early in 451 with his followers and a large number of allies, sacking Die Voderim on April 7. Other cities' attack can be determined by the hagiographic vitae written to commemorate their bishops. Nicesius was slaughtered before the altar of his church in Reims. Saint Servatius is alleged to have saved Tongarine with his prayers, as Genevieve is to have saved Paris. Lupus, Bishop of Troyes, is also credited with saving his city by meeting Attila in person. According to Hughes, there are two possible explanations for Attila's widespread devastation of Gaul. The first is that Attila's main column crossed the Rhine at Worms or Mainz and then marched to Trier, Metz, Reims, and finally Orleans, while sending a small detachment north into Frankish territory to plunder the countryside. The second is that Attila divided his army into 2 or 3 columns and crossed at different points. But he argues this is unlikely since coordination would be difficult if any of the columns were threatened and that too many unknowns were involved. With the Roman opposition, Attila's army had reached Aurelianum before June. According to Jordanus, the Alan king Sangiban, whose foederati realm included Aurelianum, had promised to open the city gates. This siege is confirmed by the account of the Vitares Anniani and in the later account of Gregory of Tours, although Sangiban's name does not appear in their accounts. However, the inhabitants of Aurelianum shut their gates against the advancing invaders. Attila began to besiege the city, while he waited for Sangiban to deliver on his promise. Both Hughes and Kim agree that the siege of Aurelianum was the high point of Attila's attack on the west, and the staunch Alan defense of the city was the real decisive factor in the War of 451. Kim also argues that the Alans were never planning to defect as they were the loyal backbone of the Roman defense in Gaul. Battle. Upon learning of the invasion, the Magister Utriusque militia Flavius Aetius moved his army quickly from Italy into Gaul. According to Sidonius Apollinaris, he was leading forth a force consisting of few and sparse auxiliaries without one regular soldier. Hughes argues the insignificant number of Roman troops reported is due to the fact the majority of Aetius' army was stationed in Gaul. He immediately attempted to convince Theodoric I, king of the Visigoths, to join him. Allegedly Theodoric learned how few troops Aetius had with him and decided it was wiser to wait to oppose the Huns in his own lands. So Aetius turned then to the former Praetorian prefect of Gaul, Avitus, for help. Supposedly Avitus was not only able to convince Theodoric to join with the Romans but also a number of other wavering barbarian residents in Gaul. Hughes suggests the coalition probably assembled at Arles before moving to meet the Goths at Toulouse, and that the army was supplied by Tonatius Ferriolus, who had been preparing for a Hunnic attack for a few years prior. The combined armies then marched to Aurelianum, reaching that city on June 14. There are two different accounts of the siege of Aurelianum, and Hughes suggests that combining them provides a better understanding of what happened. The Vita Sancti Anniani claims that the city was besieged when 4 days of heavy rain hampered the Hunnic assault. After the rain cleared, on June 14, they assaulted the city and managed to breach the walls. When word reached the Huns that Aetius' forces were in the immediate vicinity, Hughes suggests that it was at this point in the account that Attila called off the attack and began his retreat out of Gaul. Aetius and his coalition began to pursue Attila, whom Kim argues was leaving Gaul with the majority of his objectives completed. The two forces at last met somewhere on the Catalaunian field circa June 20, a date first proposed by J.B. Berry and since accepted by many, although some sources claim September 20. According to Jordanus, the night before the main battle, some of the Franks allied with the Romans encountered a band of the Gepids loyal to Attila and engaged them in a skirmish. Jordan's recorded number of 15,000 dead on either side for this skirmish is not verifiable. Allegedly, Attila had his diviners examine the entrails of a sacrifice the morning of the day of the battle. They foretold disaster would befall the Huns, but one of the enemy leaders would be killed. Attila delayed until the 9th hour so the impending sunset would help his troops to flee the battlefield in case of defeat. Hughes takes his own interpretation of this, noting that the divination may be an emphasis of Attila's barbarity and therefore possibly a fabrication. He states that the choice to begin the battle at the 9th hour was due to the fact both sides spent the whole day carefully deploying their coalition armies. According to Jordanus, the Catalaunian plain rose on one side by a sharp slope to a ridge. This geographical feature dominated the battlefield and became the center of the battle. The Huns first seized the right side of the ridge, while the Romans seized the left, with the crest unoccupied between them. Jordanus explains that the Visigoths held the right side, the Romans the left, with Sangiban of uncertain loyalty and his Alans surrounded in the middle. The Hunnic forces attempted to take the ridge, but were outstripped by the Romans under Aetius and the Gothic left flank under Thorismund. The Huns remained unable to take the ridge, but allegedly routed the Alans under Sangiban. Jordanus goes on to state that Theodoric, whilst leading his own men against the enemy Goths, was killed in the assault without his men noticing. He then states that Theodoric was either thrown from his horse and trampled to death by his advancing men, or slain by the spear of the Goth Andag. Since Jordanus served as the notary of Andag's son Gunthagus, even if this latter story is not true, this version was certainly a proud family tradition. Then Jordanus claims the Visigoths outstripped the speed of the Alans beside them and fell upon Attia's own Hunnic household unit. Attia was forced to seek refuge in his own camp, which he had fortified with wagons. The Romano-Gothic charge apparently swept past the Hunnic camp in pursuit. When night fell, Thorismund, son of King Theodoric, returning to friendly lines, mistakenly entered Attila's encampment. There he was wounded in the ensuing melee before his followers could rescue him. Darkness also separated Aetius from his own men. As he feared that disaster had befallen him, he spent the rest of the night with his Gothic allies. On the following day, finding the battlefield was piled high with bodies and the Huns did not venture forth, the Goths and Romans met to decide their next move. Knowing that Attila was low on provisions and was hindered from approaching by a shower of arrows placed within the confines of the Roman camp, they started to besiege his camp. In this desperate situation, Attila remained unbowed and heaped up a funeral pyre of horse saddles, so that if the enemy should attack him, he was determined to cast himself into the flames, that none might have the joy of wounding him and that the lord of so many races might not fall into the hands of his foes. While Attila was trapped in his camp, the Visigoths searched for their missing king and his son Thorismund. After a long search, they found Theodorac's corpse beneath a mound of corpses and bore him away with heroic songs in sight of the enemy. Upon learning of his father's death, Thorismund wanted to assault Attia's camp, but Aetius dissuaded him. According to Jordanus, Aetius feared that if the Huns were completely destroyed, the Visigoths would break off their allegiance to the Roman Empire and become an even graver threat. So Aetius convinced Thorismund to quickly return home and secure the throne for himself before his brothers could. Otherwise, civil war would ensue among the Visigoths. Thorismund quickly returned to Tolosa and became king without any resistance. Gregory of Tours claims Aetius used the same reasoning to dismiss his Frankish allies, and collected the booty of the battlefield for himself. Outcome of the battle. There are two major interpretations of Jordan's account. There is the traditional view that the battle was either inconclusive or a Roman victory, and the recent proposal that the battle was a defeat for Aetius and his coalition. As a Roman victory in the traditional account, modern scholars take a very direct interpretation of Jordanus, although usually with various points of contention. Modern scholars tend to agree that the battle took place on a long ridge, not a plain with a hill to one side. Hughes argues that the Huns deploy in the center, with their vassals on the wings, because they were expecting a Roman infantry center, with cavalry wings. This way Attia could pin down the center with the disorganized Hunnic style of warfare, while the majority of his troops focused on breaking one or both of the enemy flanks. However, Hughes argues that the Romans were expecting this, which is why he placed the Alans in the center of the formation, who were skilled cavalrymen and had advanced knowledge of how to fight alongside the Roman style of warfare. Batrach also notes that Jordan's point of placing the Alans in the center due to disloyalty is bias on Jordan's part. Jordan's description of the battle, according to Hughes, takes place from the Roman perspective. Attila's forces arrived on the ridge first, on the far right side, before the Visigoths could take that position. Then the Romans arrived on the left side of the ridge, and repulsed the Gepids as they came up. Finally the Alans and the Visigoths under Thorismund fought their way up and secured the center of the ridge, holding it against the Goths. The final phase of the battle is characterized by the Gothic attempt to take the right side of the ridge, in which Theodoric is slain, the rest of his army unaware of his death. It is at this point that Thorismund located Attila's position in the Hunnic battle line, and attacked the Hunnic center, nearly slaying Attila himself and forcing the Hunnic center to retreat. At this point both armies fell into confusion as darkness descended, and neither side knew the outcome of the battle until the following morning. After the battle, the Allies decided what to do next, and resolved to place Attila under siege for a few days while they discussed the matter. Aetius allegedly persuaded both Thorismund and the Goths, and the Franks as well, to leave the battle and return home. Hughes argues that since the Franks were fighting a civil war in the battle, and Thorismund had 5 brothers who could usurp his newfound position as king, that it is likely Aetius did advise them to do so. O'Flynn argues that Aetius persuaded the Visigoths to return home in order to eliminate a group of volatile allies, and argues that he let Attila escape because he would have been just as happy to make an alliance with them as with the Visigoths. The majority of historians also share the view that at this point Attila's aura of invincibility was broken, and that Aetius allowed the Huns to retreat in the hopes he could return to a status of partnership with them and draw on the Huns for future military support. The battle, almost immediately afterwards, then became famous for its staggering death toll. As a Roman defeat, Kim, in his recent work on the Huns, takes a radically different view of the battle's outcome. Kim suggests that, in fact, the entire battle is a play on the Battle of Marathon, with the Romans being the Plataeans on the left, the Alans the weak Athenian center, and the Goths the Athenian regulars on the right, with Theodoric as Miltiades and Thorismund as Callimachus. The return home by the Goths to secure Thorismund's throne is the same as the return to Athens to protect it from sedition and the Persian navy. Kim also suggests a radically different outcome of the battle. His argument is mostly based on the description of the positions of various forces after the battle, which he believes to be the part that is actually factual. Thorismund and Aetius both lose track of their armies, both in the middle of the enemy army in the confusion of the night. With Aetius fearing that disaster had happened, he argues the important piece of information given is that the Huns were unable to near the Roman camp because of the archers positioned within it, stating that what really happened is that the Roman coalition had routed and the Huns had chased him back to their camps, not Attila being chased to his. Kim uses this to build a new interpretation. After Theodoric is killed, the Gothic line routes and leaves a gap in the line for the Huns to exploit, making the Visigoths at fault for the disaster. He says that Jordanes tries to place the fault on the Alans, who bore the brunt of the battle in the center because they were the most reliable of the Allied forces and a hindrance to Visigothic hegemony in the region at the time. However, Kim's views have received a mixed reception among scholars of the period, with one reviewer noting that much of the text amounts to a confused and confusing story, involving the rewriting of histories, genealogies and chronologies, exacerbated by strange and clumsy conflations. They therefore should be taken with a grain of salt.